Okay, hello, and thank you for allowing me to be here with you. So my name's Candice Silversides, and I'm editor-in-chief of one of the ACC journals called JACC Advances. It's one of the new general cardiology JACC journals. Um, And some of what we're going to talk about here might overlap a little bit, but it's just to give you different perspectives on things. So first of all, there are many, many cardiovascular journals out there. If you look at Web of Science, there's more than 120. And one of the issues is trying to pick which journal might be best for your research. And so that's one of the things I wanted to start with. How do you choose an appropriate journal for your research? So the first thing you want to do is just understand the scope of the journal and is it aligned with your research topic? And you may wonder, how do you find the exact scope of any one of those 120 journals? Well, the way to do it is to actually look on the journal website. So first of all, I said the first step before we even go into that is to decide, do you want a general cardiology journal or a specific cardiology journal? So you've heard about Circ Research. If you have basic science research, those are who you're going to target. But for instance, if you have research on EP or cardio-oncology, you may be going to a sister journal, not a general cardiology journal. So first you need to decide kind of broadly what kind of journal you're looking for, and then you need to decide very specifically what the scope of the journal is. And the way you can do that, if you don't already know it for the journal you're looking into, is to actually go to the journal's website and look at about this journal. All the journals have it. You can click on it. It'll tell you specifically what the journal is looking for. So I think it's really, and you've already heard it, but being aligned with the scope of the journal is really important. There's other things you can do to make sure your paper is finding a home in the right place. Beyond determining the scope of the journal. You can also consider the audience. So for instance, if you're doing work here in Canada you think is relevant to Canadians, you may want to look for CJC or one of the Canadian journals as an example. And if you're from another part of the world, that may also be relevant. And then the other thing is if you just aren't really sure where you're going to submit your paper, I mean, this is a website that just has suggestions. That's where I'm kind of paraphrasing it. But one of the ideas is to write your introduction, or I would say even look at your paper itself, look at where you're citing most of your papers, and that might give you a sense of the kind of journal that might be interested in the paper that you're about to submit. So I think you can use a lot of techniques to try and find, at least at the start, are you submitting it to the right place? Then other things you can do to think about, are you submitting it to the right place? Think about your own publication record. It may be that you've had good successes at places. It may be that you've submitted too many times to one journal and you maybe should get some variability. So consider your own publication record. Also talk to all your co-authors. They may, especially if you're in early career, they may have some guidance about, this type of research is most likely to be accepted in this journal. And finally, if you're really not sure, and certainly I get lots of these emails, people will send an inquiry to the editor of the journal to ask, is this aligned with what you're looking for? Does it look like it? I mean, nobody wants to waste time with their paper being submitted to 5 journals, although we've all been there and it's happened to all of us. But the reality is the more aligned you can be with the journal, the more likely you are to get it through the review process and hopefully to be accepted as well. There's another important element that's growing increasingly important when you're deciding on your journal, which is the fact there's now article-based publishing fees with many journals. So, the old model was a subscription model where universities bought subscriptions and the authors did not pay to publish, but now there's a pay-to-publish model with many journals. And so you have to consider that as well. There's lots of advantages to have article-based publishing, so that what it generally means is your paper is accessible to everybody that wants to look it up. So you can disseminate it widely, but it does come at a cost. So that would be really important to discuss with your senior author if you're a junior investigator, or to make sure that you do have funding, because some of these costs can be fairly significant. And sometimes, honestly, we have papers go through the peer review process, and only then do people realize at JACC Advances, where we are article-based publishing, that there's a cost to it, even though it is embedded in all our decision letters. But that's increasingly important. And the last tip I want to say just about picking where you're going to find a home for your research is that you should make sure it's not a predatory journal. So the issue is that there's increasing number of predatory journals out there. These are journals that aren't really legitimate but are happy to charge you to publish a paper. The problem is, these websites may be around only for a short duration of time. Your paper may go in, once the website's down, nobody has access to your paper and they're not legitimate. So a question that often comes up is, well, how would you know if it's a predatory journal? Because sometimes, many of you in this crowd, I am certain, are getting lots of emails from journals saying, hey, we're looking for papers on this topic, would you consider submitting? But you do want to make sure it's a legitimate journal. Just a few little tips. I've got a citation here from Elsevier. You can go there and everything I'm about to tell you is in a lot more detail. But if you get an email you think you might want to submit, check it out. But if you go to Elsevier's website, it'll give you lots of nuances of how to pick out the predatory journal. But just very generally, with predatory journals, sometimes the name is a little off. It sounds like a familiar journal, like maybe Circ Research, but it's Circulation Research for All. I don't know, I'm just making that up. But, it would have some variation on a very prominent journal. The other issue is you should look at the websites. Sometimes the websites are glaringly obvious that it's predatory because there's errors and mistakes, and it clearly just isn't legitimate. Sometimes, on a website, there is criteria for any journal, and there's publishing criteria that has to be displayed for authors. It includes they have to provide a plan for archiving. So how are they going to keep that paper archived so that someone in 20 years will have access to it? There's also publication ethics that should be on the website. The website should also explain the copyright terms. It should also include all those peer review metrics you just heard that incidentally were amazing for Circ Research. I'm so impressed at Circ Research and the turnaround times and the peer review metrics, but all of that should be on the website. And if it's not, you should be questioning whether or not you have a legitimate journal. So once you've decided on your journal, now you have to submit your paper. You've heard about lots of the steps. I'm just going to highlight a few little points. The first thing I want to highlight is you're going to get decision letters back, some of which you've heard about. I'm going to review them again just to get them in your brain, but don't take it personally. Sometimes when your rejection has nothing to do with what might be a great paper. Certainly some of the research I've done in my life, which is clinical cardiology research, it's been rejected from good journals. It's landed in maybe what I would think would be a lower tier journal, and yet I'm mostly proud of it if it gets into a journal. So try not to take it personally, because sometimes those rejections, and you've already heard, are really not personable. They're just your paper is not aligned. It's not a good fit for the journal. So again, don't take it personally. And as you've also heard, many of the journals, like the AHA journals and the ACC journals, have sister journals. So papers get moved around where you try and find the best fit for the paper. And again, then you would get a letter back. So these would be the two first decisions you might get in an expedited way. If not, your paper will get sent for review, and you've heard a little bit about that review process. There's a lot, we could go through this review process endlessly, but because there's lots of issues. Peer review is not a perfect system. There certainly can be bias in the peer review system, but it is what we have right now. Typically, the author is blinded, doesn't know who the reviewer is, but the reviewer would know the author group. However, just to let you know, people are trying to find less biased ways to do peer review, and some of the ideas and some of the journals out there have been either doing double blind, so both the author and the reviewer don't know who's who. The reviewer is actually blinded to the group that's submitting the paper. So I feel like the Journal of Heart Failure is doing that right now to try and minimize bias. And some journals are now trying to use full open reviews. But I think it is something that is evolving about how to try and get peer review as fair as possible. And just so you know, I'm sure every journal right now thinks about how that can be done. So we've already kind of seen this kind of timeline about how the process works. You may get one of those initial decision letters. If not, your paper goes out for review, and then the reviews come back, and then the paper is adjudicated by the editorial team. So I want to just again highlight decision letters. You've heard again, but just to stress some important points about getting those decision letters back. So there's 5 potential answers you might get back if your paper's gone out for peer review. Unfortunately, the first is disappointing. It means that both the reviewers and the editorial team don't think the paper is acceptable. But the other 4 potential responses, you should all treat somewhat optimistically. So I'm just going to remind you what they are for all those people as they come back, because certainly, especially something like reject with de novo, I definitely get emails saying, should I really bother if it's a reject with de novo? Well, what I'll tell you is that that does mean the editorial board thought the paper was interesting. They just thought there was fundamentally some big things that would need to be addressed before it would ever move forward. So they're big issues. Often you have to reanalyze something, but it does mean there's interest by the journal. And so if you think you can address your reviews, I would strongly encourage you to submit a de novo, because I do think it means there's interest. You also might get an interest with major or minor revisions, and you've already heard it, but just to highlight, usually the difference is major revisions means they want some more analyses done, and minor are you don't necessarily have to go back to your data and start from scratch. That's usually the difference between those two, and then of course, hopefully you get to an accept. So this is my last slide, I believe. I just want to talk about some common pitfalls in this whole process. The first, as I said, is finding, the right home for your journal, and it is worth trying to really see if your paper is aligned with certain journals, because as I said, it wastes less of your time, and you're more likely to get it moving through the system and get reviews, and then you can revise and ultimately get your paper published. The best papers come from the best studies, so weak study design is going to be a problem at any journal. So I'm just making a plug to really think really think in advance about your study and how you're conducting it, and what the potential limitations or biases are, and how you might be able to mitigate them. So think about that all very early, because the better you design a study, the more likely you will publish your paper. Writing can be an issue, but just so you know, I think most of the major journals have editorial services. So if English isn't your first language, often journals will try and help you with some of the language editing stuff if you need it. Number 4 and 5 kind of come together, because it really is important to know what your study is about and how it fits into the big picture, because you've already heard that's partly how things are going to be adjudicated. Is this moving the needle forward in some way? So if you really haven't, before you started, done a good lit review, really understand what your study is about and how it fits into missing pieces of science out there, you may finish your whole thing, write your paper, and find, oh, people have already done this study, or I'm not really adding anything to the literature at this time. So that it really does, apart from a good study design, also know the literature in the field you're about to study, so that you don't duplicate what's already out there. The last bits are just in terms of writing style. I think it's important. Something that can really grate at reviewers is if you overstate your conclusions. So your conclusions should be aligned with your study findings. Don't make big, broad conclusions that aren't supported by your data, because that does annoy reviewers, just as a little tip. And then you've heard about it. You've heard already about the importance of having a good visualization of your data, because people will screen your papers for it. And let alone, this is your main message. I mean, cardiologists are generally pretty visual people, so visualization of data is really important for getting your ideas out there in an efficient way. And then finally, you've again heard a little bit about this, but it is important to address revisions in your responses in a meaningful way, so that both the editors, and sometimes those papers will go back to the reviewers, and the reviewers that did the original review can decide if you've addressed things adequately. So I think, thank you very much for listening, everybody. I hope you're having a good meeting, and I think Slava now has plans for us.